Hey guys, tonight we wake to the sound of footsteps on packed earth, the rustle of wool cloaks, and the clatter of clay mugs on wooden tables. You're not in your cozy 21st century bedroom anymore. You're lying on a straw mattress in a smoky longhouse, somewhere along a fjord in Viking Age Scandinavia. Outside, the wind carries the smell of pine smoke and roasting barley, and inside, a very grumpy woman is loudly reminding someone that the goat still hasn't been milked. You stretch, blinking away the haze of sleep, and realize today's the day. A Viking wedding is about to begin, and it's not someone else's. It's yours. You probably won't survive this. The house is buzzing with energy. Children scurry underfoot, chasing a chicken that has inconveniently escaped its fate. Aunties with thick braids and thicker elbows bark orders and slap hands away from the bread. At the far end of the room, your soon-to-be in-laws are arguing over where the benches should go, and whether the carved Thor's hammer is crooked on the altar shelf. You can't tell if that's an omen or just a shoddy woodworker. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time. I love knowing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand about Viking weddings is that they weren't really about falling in love. Sure, affection might develop eventually, especially if the couple shared an interest in fishing or a mutual dislike of the same neighbor, but the marriage itself was an event rooted in law, economics, and tradition. And despite what modern rom-coms would have you believe, a Viking bride didn't walk down the aisle to the sound of violins. She was more likely to step through a muddy yard, holding onto a carved staff and wearing a weighty headdress that was probably older than she was. You shift on your seat as a woman begins to braid your hair, tight, crown-like rows that tug at your scalp and seem designed to make you look noble and slightly annoyed. Meanwhile, someone is laying out the feast. Dried fish, barley cakes, a suspiciously green cheese, and a barrel of something that smells like old apples and regret. That's the mead, and you'll be drinking plenty of it later. Mainstream historians agree that Viking weddings were community affairs, loud, long, and filled with ceremonial gestures. But historians still argue whether these rituals were truly spiritual or simply performative, more for public affirmation than divine blessing. What's clear is that weddings had to be witnessed. They weren't private, that was the whole point. A marriage was only valid if people saw it happen, and could later testify about what they saw. So, no pressure. You only have to impress the whole village. A fringe theory, one that doesn't show up in most textbooks, suggests that in some remote regions, marriage rituals were conducted at dawn, beside rivers or sacred groves, invoking spirits of the land as well as the gods. Whether or not that's true, it's clear that location mattered. And since your ceremony will be held under an open sky, because, of course, the roof started leaking last week, you'll have plenty of fresh air to contemplate your future. Now someone is shoving a carved chest in front of you. Inside are the garments you'll wear: woolen tunic, embroidered apron, a belt adorned with iron keys. The keys symbolize your new role as keeper of the household. You're expected to manage supplies, food stores, and maybe even a few slaves if you're from a wealthy family. Romantic, right? A small girl, your cousin, maybe, hands you a pouch of herbs to tuck into your neckline, for luck, or to keep the fleas off. No one's quite sure anymore. You steal a glance outside, and your betrothed is standing stiffly near the fire pit, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. That's a good sign. It means he's just as terrified as you. His beard is neatly combed, probably for the first time in months, and someone's tied a bone charm around his neck. Protection against curses, or maybe brides. The village dogs bark as the elder approaches. She's old, wrinkled, and sharp-eyed, with a voice like crackling birch bark. She'll be officiating the hand fasting. The symbolic binding of hands that marks the legal moment of union. In some traditions, the bride and groom's hands are tied together with colored cords or woven ribbon. In others, they simply clasp wrists in front of witnesses while an elder declares them married under the watchful gaze of the gods. Either way, it's more legally binding than most Viking contracts, and considerably more public. As the preparations continue, you notice your mother slipping something into your belt, a small pouch of silver coins. It's not just for show, it's part of your personal dowry. And, technically, it remains yours even after marriage. Viking women retained control of certain personal assets, one of the many ways they wielded quiet power within a patriarchal structure. And if your marriage turned sour, well, those coins might buy your escape. But that's for another day. For now, the crowd begins to gather. Someone lights a fire. Someone else starts to sing, a low, droning chant that echoes off the stones. You take a deep breath, feeling the tightness of your braids, the itch of wool, the weight of expectation. The wedding is about to begin. The chanting fades, replaced by the grumble of boots and the clinking of tankards as villagers shuffle into position. You try not to trip over your own ceremonial shoes, leather, slightly too tight, and stiff from storage. A ring of people has formed around a sacred stone slab that will serve as your makeshift altar, though you can't help but notice it was used last week to butcher a pig. A quick scrub and some pine needles have been offered in lieu of actual cleanliness. Welcome to your wedding venue. In the Viking world, a marriage didn't start with poetry and roses. It started with negotiation, and sometimes livestock. Courtship, if you could call it that, involved families more than feelings. If a young man fancied someone, or more likely, if his parents fancied her family's land, he would initiate talks not with the girl, but with her father or male guardian. And you weren't exactly consulted. You were informed, hopefully with a smile. Now, don't get too sad just yet. This wasn't always doom and gloom. In many cases, Viking women had significant say in who they married, especially if they were from powerful families. Still, the first step in Viking romance often resembled a business merger more than a moonlit stroll. Historians still argue whether Viking courtship was more transactional in rural villages or elite circles. Some believe peasants had more emotional freedom, while nobles were locked into stricter marital diplomacy. Others think it was the opposite, wealth granting a kind of leeway for affection. What we do know is that love matches were rare, but not unheard of. There are sagas that describe couples falling for each other at feasts or during travel, though these stories often end badly, usually involving blood, betrayal, and someone losing a nose. Speaking of noses, your betrothed finally glances at you. It's brief, awkward, a tiny nod. That might be the most romantic thing that happens today. You step forward with your kin behind you, like a miniature army armed with dowry chests and suspicious expressions. The groom's family mirrors your formation, the two lines facing each other across a gap filled with tension, smoke, and a very excitable dog. The match was arranged months ago, maybe longer, through a series of careful visits, coded letters, and mead-soaked conversations that sounded casual, but were anything but. A man steps forward. Your uncle. Technically. But he's acting like your general. He begins listing your virtues. Fine weaving skills, decent singing voice, only lit one building on fire, accidentally, and an ancestry that traces back to a man who may or may not have fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok. Then the other side counters with a list of their own. The groom is a skilled fisherman, once beat a berserker at arm wrestling, and owns a boat with both oars and a sail. You nod politely while your inner voice wonders how many marriages have been sealed over the promise of a decent boat. Now comes the livestock. Well, not actual cows, not today, but they're referenced. The bride price, called Munder, has already been negotiated. This isn't your price tag. Not exactly. It's a gesture of respect to your family, signaling the groom's ability to provide. Think of it as a sort of security deposit, but with goats instead of credit checks. Fringe sources suggest that in some coastal regions, bride prices were symbolic: an axe, a carved brooch, even a single prized hawk. But in wealthier clans, the gifts could be vast: chests of silver, swords, land rights, or yes, whole herds of actual livestock. One Icelandic saga even tells of a groom who gifted an entire ship crewed by freed slaves to show off his generosity. Overkill? Perhaps. Effective? Definitely. As the final terms are murmured, you see two younger cousins walking solemnly toward you with the ceremonial cloth. This is no ordinary rag. It's the binding cloth, used during the hand-fasting ceremony. The cloth is looped over your and your groom's joined hands. Then knotted, by the elder officiant. The knot is often left loose enough to be pulled free easily, symbolizing that, yes, this is a binding agreement, but not an unbreakable one. Divorce is possible. Rare, but possible. File that away for later. You glance sideways. Your groom's hand is calloused but warm. He doesn't grip too tight, doesn't flinch. That's good. Worse would be a sweaty palm or someone whispering they're still in love with their ex. You've heard of both. The crowd cheers lightly, just enough to be polite. It's not the raucous moment you expected. Viking weddings were celebrations. Yes, but solemn too. This is serious business. A binding of houses, names, resources, and maybe, just maybe, a seed of something softer growing beneath it all. The cloth is untied. The elder nods. The knot is metaphorically sealed and legally recognized by all present. That's the part that matters. No parchment, no priest, just witnesses, and a memory that everyone will now carry. Later, as the feast begins to assemble, you catch snippets of conversation. Someone's betting on how long the marriage will last. Someone else claims they once saw your husband dance on a table. A drunk cousin offers unsolicited advice involving oysters and stamina. You pretend not to hear it. You've made it through the courtship stage, or rather, the transactional negotiation stage of Viking romance. There was no serenade, no trail of flower petals, but there was a village-wide agreement, a complex system of family alliances, and a bride price that might help your siblings one day secure their own matches. And hey, you even got to keep the pouch of silver your mom tucked into your belt. Not bad for a Tuesday. The feast hasn't started yet, But the noise is building. Mugs clink, fire crackles, and someone is already slightly tipsy and yelling at the chickens. You're seated on a carved bench next to your new husband, who's busy pretending he knows how to look relaxed. Across from you, a few members of his extended family sit watching you like hawks. Polite, smiling hawks with very strong opinions. It's going to be a long evening. But let's rewind for a moment, because none of this would have happened without the backstage dealings of the true power brokers in Viking marriage, the family, the idea of two people falling in love and spontaneously deciding to marry each other. Cute. Not very Viking. More often than not, it was the parents, uncles, or even older siblings who orchestrated the entire union. You were born into a web of obligation and opportunity, and marriage was less about individual fulfillment than about strengthening our charts, or expanding that web. As a potential bride, your value wasn't just in your skills or good reputation, it was in your connections. A marriage to you could bring access to better pasture land, safer trade routes, or even protection from raiders. Likewise, if your uncle happened to owe someone a favor, congratulations, you're now a strategic peace offering. Historians still argue whether these arranged marriages were oppressive or pragmatic. Some scholars point out that many Norse women could veto matches they truly despised. Others argue that social pressure made refusal nearly impossible, especially in small villages where everyone knew your business and your goat count. Meanwhile, in the sagas, matchmakers often appear as respected figures, frequently older men or women skilled in negotiation and reading the social currents. They'd carry messages between families, propose alliances, and sometimes act as mediators in disputes. In fact, entire subplots revolve around botched proposals, jealous rivals, and the social consequences of rejecting a suitor too publicly. One unlucky matchmaker was nearly drowned in a barrel of fish heads. Ah, romance. Your own marriage was likely arranged during a long winter visit, the kind where cloaks stay on indoors and everyone pretends not to notice the frostbite. Talks would have begun with general pleasantries. How's the harvest? Killed any wolves lately? Before drifting into more serious territory. So, how about our children, Mary? If both sides were interested, the real negotiating began, and it was detailed. Dowry items were listed one by one, land rights discussed, even future inheritance arrangements outlined. That's why the feast tonight feels less like a party and more like a signed treaty with Stu. Everyone here remembers those talks. Everyone here has a stake in this marriage. And no one wants to see their careful plans unravel because the groom snores, or you hate the way he chews. Across the room, your mother-in-law is discussing your future children. Loudly, she's already naming them. You sip your mead and wonder how soon is too soon to fake a coughing fit. There's an unspoken understanding that both families will monitor your marriage's progress. If things go well, the alliance strengthens. If things sour, well, people have been known to intervene. Gently, at first, then with louder voices, then with threats of taking the goats back. But don't worry, your new family isn't just keeping tabs. They're also expected to support you. If your husband mistreats you, his family's honor is at stake. And if you become unhappy but stay silent, your own kin might feel shamed for not protecting you. The web is tight, and its strength comes from balance, not fear. One of the most fascinating fringe traditions, a matchmaking feast, not the wedding, but a pre-wedding gathering meant solely for scoping out potential unions. These often happen during annual gatherings or seasonal festivals. Young people mingled while the elders tunsei literally. There's even mention of matchsticks, small carved tokens passed discreetly to signal interest or intention. Swipe right, Viking style. A few such sticks have been found in archaeological digs, though scholars debate whether they were truly romantic or simply decorative. Historians still argue about the extent of such customs, and whether they were widespread or limited to elite circles. But they do suggest something often overlooked, that courtship, in its own structured way, did exist, just with fewer flowers and more family members peering over your shoulder. Tonight, though, none of that matters. The decision's been made. The match agreed. You're married now. Someone strikes a harp chord, awkwardly, and with slightly too much enthusiasm. A young man in a fur-trimmed tunic begins a song about a warrior who married a sea spirit. It's equal parts poetic and terrifying. The sea spirit drowns him on their honeymoon. Everyone laughs. You glance again at your husband. He catches your eye and shrugs. You're not sure if that means, "Don't worry, I can swim," or "Let's hope we survive the night." Either way, it's the first time you both smile at the same time. Not bad, for a couple arranged by their uncles. As the harp fades and the roasted lamb begins its slow, steamy procession down the banquet table, you feel the weight of a dozen stares, soft ones from curious cousins, calculating ones from elderly aunts, and one deeply unsettling glance from a toothless man chewing fish bones in the corner. You try to focus on your plate, but the room is alive with gossip. After all, you're the bride. But let's not mistake bride for doormat. You may have been traded, negotiated, or strongly nudged into this marriage. But once that knot was tied, you weren't powerless. Not even close. Viking women held a unique legal and social status for their time, unlike many of their medieval European counterparts. Norse women could own property, inherit wealth, and, crucially, divorce their husbands. That last one may sound like a modern invention, but it's as old as the sagas. Marriage was a contract, and contracts can be broken. But before we get to breaking them, let's talk about what made them binding in the first place, the dowry and the morning gift. Your dowry was a package deal, movable goods, livestock, jewelry, or land you brought into the marriage. It remained legally yours, even if your husband managed it. Kind of like when your cousin gives her boyfriend the Netflix password, but still pays the bill. If the marriage ended, the dowry returned to you, or your family, untouched. And then there was the morning gift, a separate set of valuables gifted to you the morning after the wedding night. Romantic? Debatable? Practical? Absolutely. It could be silver, a sword, or a small plot of land, meant to show the groom's appreciation, and also cement your personal wealth and independence within the household. You can think of it as a performance bonus for successful contract execution. Historians still argue about the origin of this tradition. Was it compensation for leaving your family, a sign of respect, or just a way to make sure you had some financial leverage in the years ahead? Whatever the reason, it gave you power, and in some cases, it allowed women to build private stashes of wealth, rainy day resources, in a world where it could rain betrayal at any time. Tonight, as the crowd laughs and drinks, you can feel the pouch of coins beneath your belt. You run a finger along the seam. Yours, not his, Not theirs. Yours. Meanwhile, your mother-in-law is whispering to someone about the way you held the ceremonial cloth during the hand fasting. Apparently, you tilted your wrist in a way that suggests good childbearing hips. You consider throwing a barley roll at her, but decide that's more of a second day of marriage move. Now comes the storytelling portion of the evening. A skald stands, silver beard glinting in the firelight. He begins a tale of a shield maiden who tricked her suitor into offering triple dowry by pretending to have a twin sister. The room roars with laughter. The story ends with the suitor penniless, the shield maiden sailing off with his ship, and the twin sister turning out to be a goat in a cloak. You nod approvingly. The tale might be fiction, but the theme isn't. Viking women had to be clever. They learned early how to navigate expectations, how to survive in a system designed by men without surrendering their dignity. Some did it through charm, others through silence, and some, frankly, through well-aimed axes. A fringe account from a Baltic settlement describes a wedding where the bride demanded a duel to prove her husband's worth. He obliged, lost, and married her anyway, bruised and blushing. The parchment is faded, and scholars debate whether it's historical fact or medieval fanfic. But the message is clear. Norse women weren't accessories. They were players. Your role in the marriage doesn't stop at cooking and weaving. As wife, you manage the household, an enormous task in a world without supermarkets, central heating, or YouTube tutorials. You decide when food is distributed, when guests are welcome, and whether that strange smell in the pantry means the goat cheese is ready or the cat died in there. You oversee servants, supplies, and sometimes even slaves. You are the economic and logistical core of the household. And if you come from a high-ranking family, you're expected to host gatherings, settle disputes, and act as political liaison when male relatives are off raiding. In short, you're not just the wife. You're the operations manager of an entire social unit. Congratulations. Across the hall, you see your husband laugh at something a friend says. Then he glances at you again, not as a stranger this time, but as a partner. Tentative, curious, maybe impressed. You haven't said more than 10 words to each other, but the groundwork is laid. Later tonight, you'll share a bed. The community will expect it. Sometimes, a pair of witnesses would even escort the couple to the marriage bed to confirm the act happened. Yes, awkward. Thankfully, most families spared you the audience, but the expectation of consummation lingered, and the morning gift was often conditional on it. You wonder if he snores, if he's clumsy, if he'll mind your ice-cold feet. But for now, you just sip your mead and smile slightly into your cup. They may have chosen this path for you, but how you walk it, that's still your choice. The fire burns lower now, casting long shadows that stretch across the timber walls like slow-moving spirits. The feast is in full swing. There's drumming on overturned buckets. Someone's performing a dance that involves alarming amounts of hopping, and a pair of elderly women are engaged in what appears to be a competitive turnip peeling contest. Your new husband has disappeared momentarily, off somewhere being congratulated or interrogated by his uncles. You, meanwhile, are surrounded by a gaggle of women poking at your sleeves and asking questions you're not entirely sure how to answer. Did he wash behind his ears? Does he own land or just pretend to? Did you feel the Thor's hammer tremble during the ceremony? You smile politely and pretend to sip your drink, and yet, for all the chaos and comedy, Viking weddings had deeply structured expectations, especially when it came to gifts. Because if there's one thing Norse society understood better than love, it was the fine art of contractual gifting. Let's start with the bride price, or munder, which we touched on earlier. This wasn't some crude payment for a human spouse. It was more akin to a security deposit, ensuring the bride's family that the marriage would be taken seriously. If the groom dishonored the arrangement, the bride price could be forfeited, which gave the bride's family serious leverage. So while it might look like a purchase, it was really a statement. I respect your daughter enough to stake silver and cattle on her future. Then there's your dowry, your family's contribution to the union, a carefully measured collection of goods meant to help establish the new household. It could include wool, livestock, tools, household furnishings, and even slaves. Yes, slaves. Viking society was complicated. Some families also gifted protective amulets or heirloom combs, items meant to blend the practical with the symbolic. But the real drama came after the wedding night. Enter the morning gift, or Morgan Gifu. This was the groom's personal token to the bride, typically given on the morning after the marriage was consummated. Now, while that sounds like a sweet gesture, good morning, here's a sheep, it was often a significant gift. Land, treasure, jewelry, or even legal rights to certain assets. And, unlike the bride price or dowry, the morning gift belonged to the bride alone. Historians still argue about whether the morning gift was a symbolic tradition or a required legal step. Some records suggest it was voluntary. Others hint that failing to give one could result in marital annulment, or at the very least, extremely frosty breakfasts. A fringe theory even suggests that women in some Norse communities could negotiate the morning gift beforehand. Picture it, you, leaning across a carved table, saying, I'll marry you, but I want the eastern field and 2 of the good cows. Bold? Yes, but not entirely out of character for Viking women who were known to make their voices heard when the stakes were high. You glance down now at the gift placed beside your seat, a brooch of intricate knotwork, heavy and cold in your hand. It's clearly expensive. More than that, it's meaningful. A family heirloom, perhaps, or a deliberate choice, echoing your new household status. Either way, you've just become wealthier than you were yesterday. Across the hall, the skald begins another tale, this time about a bride who demanded her morning gift in front of the entire village, threatening to set fire to the longhouse otherwise. Spoiler, she got the land, and the goat, and later became a local judge. As the story unfolds, you realize the brooch is more than jewelry. It's a public acknowledgement of your role. This isn't just your husband saying, thanks for showing up. It's him saying, I accept you as equal steward of this household, at least in theory. And if he forgets, well, you have the brooch and an entire table of ants to remind him. The feast stretches long into the night. Someone accidentally sets part of the tablecloth on fire. No one minds. A child throws a pickled herring and is scolded, gently, by a man who's already forgotten which child is his. The atmosphere becomes looser, warmer, as bellies fill and laughter rolls. Somewhere near the end of the night, your husband returns and sits beside you again. He's quiet, thoughtful. You catch him glancing at the brooch, then at you, then looking away, as if embarrassed. He reaches for his mug and says, just loud enough for you to hear, "It belonged to my mother." Then a beat. "She was terrifying." You laugh, unexpectedly, and he smiles, really smiles for the first time all day. That Right there might be your true morning gift. By the time the last cup of mead is drained and someone starts snoring into a bowl of turnip stew, the wedding feast has transformed into a glorious mess of crumbs, candles, and people sprawled over benches like tired warriors after battle. You've somehow avoided being drafted into the late-night wrestling for fun tournament, though your new cousin tried to convince you that participation was a time-honored bridal obligation. You're fairly certain it's not. And just when you think you might be allowed to slip away and collapse somewhere quiet, the drumming starts again, louder, slower. It's not a party rhythm, it's a ceremonial one, because the wedding isn't over. Not yet. In the Viking world, a marriage wasn't complete until it had been celebrated and endured over multiple days. Sometimes 8 full days. Yes, really. A week-long whirlwind of feasting, gift exchanging, formal toasts, and enough mead to drown a longship crew. It wasn't just a party. It was proof that the couple had the backing of the community, the stamina to lead a household, and at least a half-decent tolerance for fermented honey wine. Tonight is just day 1. You're escorted, gently, firmly, by a trio of older women who have appointed themselves your official wedding handlers. One adjusts your hair, another thrusts a carved wooden cup into your hands, and the third tells you with a wink that if your husband starts snoring, just poke him with a knitting needle. "That's what I did," she says cheerfully. "He doesn't snore anymore." Historians agree that Viking wedding celebrations were intense, but they still argue whether the famous 8-day wedding was standard practice or an idealized version preserved in later sagas. Some suggest it was mostly among wealthier families with the resources to host a week-long rager. Others argue it was rooted in fertility symbolism. 8 days for 8 legs of Sleipnir, Odin's mythical horse. Leave it to the Norse to tie mythology, horses, and marital stamina into one blurry tradition. One fringe tidbit suggests that each day had its own theme. Day 1 was for the formal ceremony, Day 2 for the feast, Day 3 for gift exchanges, Day 4 for games, and so on. By Day 6, people were mostly passed out. Day 7 was when the elders gave their wisdom, whether asked for or not. And Day 8, that was the hangover recovery picnic, often held by a riverbank, where people dunked their heads into icy water and swore they'd never drink again. Until the next wedding, back at your feast, someone has produced a game board, Nefatafel, the Viking version of chess. You're drafted into a match against your husband. The crowd watches eagerly as you move your pieces. You've never played, he has, but you bluff your way into trapping his king with an accidental move that makes half the table gasp. He blinks. You grin. "Beginner's luck," you say. He narrows his eyes suspiciously, but in a good way. Later, the singing begins. Not ballads, exactly, more like rhythmic chants, with clapping and stamping and an occasional off-key flute. One song is a call and response between women and men. Alternating verses about marriage, farming, and who really does the hard work in a household. Spoiler, it's the one who wakes up first to chase the goats. At some point, gifts begin to circulate. Not the formal bride price or morning gift. Those are done. These are celebration gifts, little tokens passed between guests and the couple. You receive a carved spoon, a dried apple slice pressed with runes, and, somewhat alarmingly, a bone with a face scratched into it. "It's a fertility charm," says the giver. You decide to keep it under your pillow. Maybe, eventually, As the fire dims, people begin to pair off, some into sleep, others into whispered conversations, and others still into less subtle arrangements behind the hay barrels. You and your husband find yourselves quietly removed from the crowd, walking down the edge of the longhouse toward your new quarters. There's no parade, no ceremonial tossing of flowers, just two people walking into the unknown with tired feet and full stomachs. The room is small but warm. A woven blanket covers the bed, and a faint scent of pine lingers in the corners. You both stand awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do now that the crowd is gone. He clears his throat. "I can sleep on the floor," he offers. "If you'd rather. You consider this, then shake your head. "The bed's warmer," you say. "And I have cold feet." He nods, and without another word, begins removing his boots. You sit beside him, undoing your braided belt. It's not romantic in the storybook sense, but there's a quiet comfort in it. A beginning. No fireworks, just the crackle of the hearth and the sound of your breath sinking slowly in the dark. Tomorrow, day 2 begins. There will be more guests, more food, more ale. There might be a foot race. There's definitely a wrestling match scheduled. But tonight, the fire is yours. And the future, whatever shape it takes, starts here, under this roof, with this person. You pull the blanket up to your chin and close your eyes. Dawn slips in through the gaps in the timber walls like a polite guest. Soft, golden, and a little bit too early. You stir beneath the woolen blanket, muscles aching from unfamiliar bedding, and, let's be honest, unfamiliar company. Your new husband is already awake, sitting near the fire pit, poking at the coals with a stick and pretending not to be nervous. You pretend not to notice. It's day 2 of your Viking wedding, and things are about to get significantly more religious, unlike today's weddings where couples spend months picking out flower arrangements and which Ed Sheeran song to walk down the aisle to. Viking ceremonies leaned heavily on symbols, ritual objects, and the goodwill of the gods. This wasn't just a social contract, it was a spiritual transaction, one that required the blessing of divine forces, and possibly the approval of a goat. You dress slowly, donning a new tunic embroidered with red thread. Red for luck, red for fertility, red to keep evil spirits from hiding in your undergarments. You slide on your keys, your brooch, and, reluctantly, the bone fertility charm someone gifted you last night. Might as well cover all your bases. The ceremony today is a blot, a sacrifice ritual. Not always bloody, but frequently fragrant. The whole village gathers around an open-air altar made of stones, antlers, and a small wooden effigy of Thor that looks like it was carved in a hurry. The air smells of pine resin, meat drippings, and that one guy who always wears too much bear fat. Historians agree that Viking wedding rituals often involved invoking the gods, especially Thor, for strength and protection, and Freya, for love and fertility. Couples might hold hammers, share ale from a communal horn, or make symbolic offerings to household spirits. But historians still argue whether animal sacrifices were universal practice or more of a dramatic flourish reserved for elites. The saga's love drama. After all, today, there is a goat. It bleats its confusion while being gently led to the altar. The local gothi, priest, mumbles a prayer, raises a blade, and, well, let's just say the goat now has fewer concerns. Its blood is sprinkled lightly over carved stones and onto symbolic items. including the handle of a hammer your husband holds with trembling fingers. You receive a splash across your boots. Good luck, someone whispers behind you. A fringe tradition, rare and slightly unverified, describes weddings where the bride briefly donned a helmet and carried a shield during the ceremony, symbolically leaving the warrior clan to join the household clan. It's unclear if this happened often or just once and was blown wildly out of proportion by an enthusiastic poet. But you admit, the image is kind of amazing. You and your husband exchange offerings, simple gestures. He gives you a small knife. You give him a lock of your hair, tied with ribbon. Everyone watches. No one claps. This isn't the kind of ritual where people cheer. They observe. They murmur approval. And they remember. Because weddings in Viking society weren't just personal. They were public, witnessed, cataloged, retold. If the gods weren't watching, the neighbors certainly were. As the ceremony closes, a fire is lit in a stone circle. Bread is passed around, dense, chewy, and flavored with herbs. You're handed the ceremonial horn, filled with mead, and take a sip, then another, then a third, which, according to custom, seals your participation in the rite. Your husband drinks too. His mustache is soaked. You try not to laugh. Back at the longhouse, the tone shifts. Yesterday was celebration. Today is consolidation. The two families sit down together, not as negotiators, but as partners. They discuss land, inheritance, alliances. You sit beside your husband, quietly noting who speaks with authority and who pretends they weren't asleep during the goat part. Aunt Borghild insists that your future children will have her nose. No one argues. You're presented with symbolic household items, a loom shuttle, a set of keys, a wooden ladle. Each gesture means something. Control over domestic space, authority over the pantry, responsibility for hospitality. If this sounds like a lot of work, it is. But it's also power. You now run a domain of your own. And should you ever be mistreated, these symbols become evidence, legal precedent, proof that you were a proper wife doing proper duties, and therefore entitled to a proper response. Viking society was surprisingly litigious. Wronged parties often brought disputes before the thing. A public assembly where cases were argued, judgments passed, and marriages occasionally annulled. But that's for another day. Today, you're still surrounded by well-wishers, wary cousins, and one uncle who keeps asking about when you'll start fermenting your own cabbage. The air is thick with wood smoke, laughter, and the quiet, simmering tension of change. You're not just someone's daughter anymore. You're someone's wife. And whether or not that comes with romance, you already know it comes with real responsibilities and real influence. You return to your place at the hearth. Your new husband returns with a bowl of stew and offers it with a shy shrug. You take it, and then, after a pause, offer him the better piece of meat from the bottom. No one sees it. No one records it. But that, right there, might be the most sacred exchange of the day. By the third day, your feet hurt, your voice is hoarse from polite laughter, and you've begun to suspect that every Viking wedding includes at least one person falling into a barrel of pickled fish. Today, that person was your new cousin-in-law, who then claimed, loudly, that it was a fertility omen. Sure it is. Still, your marriage is now official in every sense, witnessed, blessed, documented by gossip, and reinforced by an unholy amount of barley. But behind the smoke and songs lies something far more serious, because Viking marriages weren't just emotional or ceremonial, they were strategic, especially for people with property, titles, or political ambitions. And even if you had none of those things, marriage was still your key to social survival. You and your husband are now a unit, a legally recognized, economically intertwined alliance. But what if one of you breaks that alliance? What if he cheats? What if you do? What if there's betrayal, or boredom, or an incident involving someone else's boat, and a misunderstanding involving cheese? Today, you'll learn that the Vikings had answers for that, too. See? Marriage was deeply tied to honor. Not the kind with swords and dragons. Well, not always. But the kind that dictated your place in the community. If your marriage fell apart, it wasn't just a private matter. It affected alliances, inheritance lines, and neighborhood stability. A bad marriage was a social earthquake. That's why Norse law was so precise about marital obligations and rights. Infidelity, for example, wasn't always punished equally. A man could technically take lovers, as long as he didn't bring shame to his household or neglect his duties. But if a woman had an affair, that could be grounds for divorce, or worse, depending on the community. Historians still argue whether this double standard was uniformly applied or varied by region and status. Some sagas show powerful women getting away with far more than the average housewife. A fringe case recorded in a 12th century manuscript describes a woman named Runa who caught her husband with a servant. Rather than confront him, she challenged the servant to a boat race and beat her so badly she was too bruised to return to the household. Problem solved, apparently. But let's not get too grim. Cheating wasn't common, not because people were saints, but because the consequences were too messy. Public shame, fines, and the dreaded court at the thing could all follow. And if a wife was found to be mistreated, her family could demand compensation or even repossess her dowry, especially if her husband had broken the marriage contract in spirit or deed. This was more than just tradition. It was a legal framework. There were actual laws written, yes, written, in Old Norse that outlined when a marriage could be dissolved, how property should be divided, and who got custody of the goats. If that sounds progressive, it kind of was. And remember that morning gift? That land or jewelry or pouch of silver you received? That was yours to keep even after divorce, unless it could be proven you had broken the marriage through misconduct. If your husband wanted to leave you, he had to build a case. So much for a no-fault breakup. You glance at your husband now, across the yard. He's feeding a chicken and talking to it like it's a trusted advisor. So far, so good. Still, you're not naive. You know that some marriages break down, even in a world where divorce meant shame and scandal. But here's the twist. It didn't always end in misery. In Viking culture, divorce was possible and sometimes even mutual. A wife could declare a divorce by simply calling witnesses and announcing her separation at the threshold of her home. 3 times. That's it. No courtroom. No priest. Just a public declaration that you were done. If your reasons were sound, neglect, abuse, infidelity, you could leave with your property, your dowry, and your dignity. You might face gossip, but you wouldn't be ruined. One recorded instance in the Icelandic sagas tells of a woman who divorced her husband because he refused to wash regularly. He smells like rotting herring, she allegedly said. The thing sided with her. Of course, not every split was so clean. If children were involved, if land was in dispute, if families had debts between them, it could get messy. Witnesses were called, elders made judgment, but the very fact that divorce existed and was navigable speaks volumes about the legal sophistication of Viking society. So tonight, as you sit with your husband and help him sort dried herbs into little pouches, you're not sure why, but he seems to think it's important. You feel a strange sense of balance. You're bound to this person, yes, but not chained. You have rights. He has duties. You both have agency. This isn't a fairy tale, but it's not a prison either. You reach for the heaviest pouch, the one filled with what he claims is dried nettle, and give him a skeptical look. Are you sure this won't make us itch? He shrugs. Only a little. Marriage, you realize, is mostly a long series of these moments. Negotiations, compromises, shared jokes about herbal mishaps, not grand gestures, not eternal vows shouted into the wind, just two people choosing to stay at the hearth, or not. The next morning, you wake to the smell of smoked fish and burnt porridge, two scents that, in Viking society, often meant someone was making breakfast and someone else had gotten distracted trying to light the fire with damp moss. You peek through the door frame and spot your husband outside, waving a stick at a crow. You're not sure who's winning. It's day 4 of your wedding celebration, and if you thought things might calm down, oh, no. Today is about storytelling, drinking contests, and proving, publicly, that your new household is a functional social unit, which, apparently, involves wrestling matches, riddle competitions, and at least one uncle attempting to juggle turnips. But beneath the mead and mischief lies a darker truth. Not all marriages are built on affection, or even choice, because while your marriage was arranged with some measure of agreement and several goats, many others were not. Some Viking women didn't just marry. They were taken as concubines, hostages, or prizes of war. Now, let's tread carefully here. Not every Viking raider was a villain twirling his mustache, or whatever the Norse equivalent was, maybe braiding his beard ominously. But warfare was central to Viking life, and with it came a grim reality. Women were often collateral, bargaining chips, or unwilling additions to the household. Concubinage, for instance, was an accepted, if morally slippery, part of Viking culture. A man could have a wife and one or more concubines, especially if he was wealthy or well-traveled. These women could be local servants or foreign captives, brought home after raids. Their status varied wildly. Some became respected household members. Others lived lives of silent servitude. Historians still argue about the legal standing of concubines in Viking law. Some texts suggest they had protections, basic rights to food, shelter, and, occasionally, freedom. Others paint a bleaker picture, especially in foreign lands where Norse settlers took local women without formal union. The sagas are often vague, perhaps deliberately so. One fringe account from a 10th century Slavic chronicle mentions a Viking war leader who gave his favorite concubine a silver comb and allowed her to sit at the family table, shocking his wife, who promptly threw the comb into the fire. The concubine retrieved it, burned fingers and all, and was later found running her own trade stall in the marketplace. That's not a love story, it's a power play. As the day unfolds, you see these tensions reflected in subtle ways. A distant cousin arrives with a young woman in tow. Quiet, pale, unfamiliar. No one introduces her. She stands behind him, eyes down, hands folded. She might be a servant. She might be something else. No one asks. You wonder if she speaks your language. You try to catch her eye, offer a smile. She glances away quickly. The reality of Viking marriage customs isn't just festive songs and decorative axes. It includes silence, invisibility, survival. Back at the feast, someone challenges your husband to a drinking contest. You roll your eyes and place a bucket nearby. You've heard this story before? It never ends cleanly. Later, as the sun dips low and people begin pairing off for another night of chaotic celebration, you find yourself seated next to your new sister-in-law. She's sharpening a knife with unsettling focus. "Heard you know how to use a spindle," she says. You nod. "Good, but also learn the knife, just in case." It's unclear whether she's joking. Marriage, in the Viking world, came with layers. The public face, feasting, fertility, oaths, the legal spine, dowries, mourning gifts, land rights, and then the shadows, hostages, concubines, quiet resistance. But here's what makes it complicated. Not all concubines were oppressed. Some gained power. Some outlived the wives. Some even bore sons who inherited land and titles. Viking society wasn't frozen in moral clarity. It was practical, messy, real, and so, as you return to your shared bed that night, the fire low, the distant sound of someone vomiting into a water barrel echoing through the dark, you whisper to your husband, "Do you think all marriages are like this?" He thinks for a moment. "No," he says. "Some are worse." You both laugh, quietly. You think of that quiet woman behind your cousin, of the concubine with the burned fingers, of the wives who didn't get to choose, and you decide, then and there, to make your household one where voices are heard, even if softly, even if only at first. Because in a world where marriages are more than love or war, sometimes the greatest act of power is simply being seen. You awaken to shouting, not angry shouting, more the kind of noise that happens when two people try to carry a goat through a narrow doorway while arguing about whose idea it was in the first place. You stretch, pull the wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, and peer out into day 5 of your Viking wedding. If yesterday was about shadowy truths, today is about open drama. You've heard the rumors swirling all morning. There's going to be a public dispute, not over livestock, not over ale rations, over a marriage. And not just any marriage, a dissolving one. A couple from a nearby village has come to the thing, the local assembly, to settle a disagreement. And since your own wedding has drawn the community together, everyone's already here, bellies full, tongues loose, and itching for entertainment. This is not unusual. Viking society, ever the blend of honor and law, handled personal disputes in the most public way possible, a legal gathering where the community heard complaints, examined facts, and rendered judgment. If you thought family dinners were tense, try airing your marriage grievances in front of 50 people and an elder who smells like garlic and goat fur. The accused party today? A man who allegedly gave away his wife's dowry comb to his mistress. That might sound minor, until you remember that dowries were protected assets. By law, a husband couldn't sell, trade, or gift anything that belonged to his wife's dowry, and definitely not to someone he was sharing a bed with behind her back. The wife stands proud, flanked by her sisters and mother, arms crossed, expression flat. The husband? He looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. A small wooden chest. Evidence, apparently, is brought forward. Inside is the comb, cracked, used, insult added to injury. Historians still argue whether women in Viking society had true autonomy in these settings, or whether their family networks made all the difference. But sagas and legal codes alike confirm that women did bring cases to the thing, especially in matters of mistreatment, broken vows, or disputes over property. They weren't passive observers of the system. They used it. A fringe account from 11th century Denmark describes a woman who denied a divorce, instead filed a lawsuit claiming spiritual damage. The court didn't know what to do with that, so they fined the husband 3 goats and ordered him to write an apology rune, which he did. Poorly. In today's case, the thing rules swiftly. The husband must pay restitution in silver and return the rest of his wife's dowry. She's granted legal separation. The crowd erupts in polite clapping and a few satisfied nods. Someone nearby mutters, "Should have just bought her a new comb." Body, no. You watch it all from the edges, heart thumping not with fear, but with awareness. This is your future too. If your marriage goes sour, this is where it will end up, not in whispered gossip, but in a circle of benches, in front of friends and enemies alike, with your dignity on the line. And yet, there's something strangely reassuring about it. A system, a process, not perfect, not painless, but present. You won't vanish into the void if things go wrong. You'll stand here, just like her, and speak your truth, with or without goats. Back at the longhouse, the mood lightens. People always love a good scandal, as long as it isn't theirs. The men start a game involving throwing bones at a target, while the women gossip in low tones about who knew what and when. One elderly man suggests the comb incident was actually a prophecy from a dream he had 3 years ago. No one believes him. You return to your place near the hearth, where your husband is attempting to carve something into a piece of driftwood. "It's a wolf," he says, holding it up proudly. You squint. "Looks like a duck." He frowns. "A dangerous duck." You laugh. And for a moment in Nachi, the tension of the day slips away. Later, as the fire dies and the crowd begins to settle for the night, you lie awake replaying the trial in your mind, not because you fear it, but because you respect it. The structure, the clarity, the chance to be heard. Viking marriage may have been strategic, political, and messy, but it was also surrounded by a web of accountability, community enforcement, legal recourse, and, in the end, a reminder that even in a world of warriors and wooden combs, women had tools too. You wake to the scent of ash and honey, not in a poetic sense. Someone dropped a pot of mead into the hearth and then tried to scoop it out with their bare hands. The smell now lives permanently in the longhouse, and you suspect, in your hair, it's day 6. And while most of the guests are slowly recovering from yesterday's public marital drama, you're busy dodging Aunt Borghild's aggressive attempts to involve you in the morning skaldic poetry contest. You try to hide, but she's faster than she looks and cornered you near the pickled herring barrel. Again, still, today brings something quieter, more reflective, a moment to think not just about marriage and ceremony, but about the ways people escape those expectations, because for every well-arranged union, There was at least one clever person trying to wriggle out of one, preferably without causing a blood feud. Viking law allowed for divorce. Yes. But even before that, some people tried to avoid the entire situation altogether through legal loopholes, tactical vanishings, and well-timed acts of social chaos. You sip your barley tea and prepare to take mental notes. Let's start with the classic, the runaway bride. It sounds like a modern movie trope, but it happened. If a woman was betrothed and refused to go through with the wedding, she had several risky options. She could appeal to the thing, claiming the arrangement was made without her consent. She could gather witnesses to testify that the groom was unfit, abusive, dishonorable, or just plain gross. Or, most dramatically, she could simply disappear. Historians still argue whether this kind of disappearance was common or merely the stuff of saga fiction. In some tales, runaway brides are caught and dragged back, shamed or punished. In others, they escape entirely, fleeing to distant relatives or disguising themselves as men to live freely, at least until the next wedding season. One famous fringe tale tells of a woman named Signy who, faced with marrying a man twice her age, stole his boat the night before the ceremony and sailed to Iceland, where she reinvented herself as a cloth merchant. Later, when the ex-groom showed up demanding compensation, she offered him a fine wool cloak and a smug smile. He took it and left. Saga logic at its finest. There were also legal options for backing out of an engagement, especially if either party had misrepresented themselves. Did the groom claim he owned land that actually belonged to his cousin? Marriage annulled. Did the bride's family promise a dowry of 5 cows and deliver only 3 skinny goats? Lawsuit. The Viking world wasn't just run on axes and oaths, it was run on contracts, and people loved to argue about the fine print. A particularly interesting legal maneuver was the use of witnesses, not just for the wedding itself, but for everything leading up to it. If you, say, wanted to break off a betrothal, it helped to have witnesses confirm that no formal gift had been exchanged, no oath sworn, no ceremonial ale shared. Without those elements, you could claim it wasn't really binding, sort of like insisting your ex wasn't technically your ex because we never changed our Facebook status. You recall your own wedding preparations, the way your mother fussed over each item, making sure the dowry chest was publicly displayed, the hand-fasting witnessed by the right elders, not just tradition, but legal insurance. Back at the longhouse, 2 teenage girls are whispering near the fire pit. One pretends to swoon and says, "Oh no, I forgot to mention I don't like fish. Guess the wedding's off." The other cackles and says, "Better than marrying Arnie. His breath smells like old cheese." You smile. Even now, people are plotting their futures in subtle, rebellious ways. It wasn't just women who tried to escape bad matches, either. Some men, especially younger sons with no land, would break off engagements if the dowry didn't meet expectations or if a better match came along. And then there were the delayers, those who found ever more creative reasons to postpone the wedding indefinitely. I need to finish carving this runestone. The goats are sick. Mercury is in retrograde. Okay. Not that one. And of course, some engagements ended the Viking way, with a duel. No, really. If 2 suitors claimed the same bride, and she hadn't chosen, the matter could be settled in combat. Occasionally, the bride even watched. No pressure. Some sagas describe women choosing who they wanted to marry based on who won, or in rare cases, based on who showed restraint. One woman famously rejected both fighters and married a shepherd instead. His sheep were better behaved. You glance at your husband now, asleep with a half-eaten honey cake resting on his chest. You don't need a duel to confirm he's not perfect, but he did offer you the last piece of dried apple last night. That counts for something. In the end, Viking marriage wasn't a trap. It was a structure, with ladders, trapdoors, and a surprising number of escape hatches. If you were smart, connected, or just incredibly stubborn, you could find a way out. But if you were lucky, you didn't have to. By day 7, the feast begins to feel like a second home. You know where the creaky plank is in the longhouse floor, which ladle doesn't burn your hand, and how to gracefully refuse your 8th cup of mead without offending someone's grandmother. You also know that if you hear the phrase, "just one more toast" again, you might politely walk into the sea. Today, though, the tone has shifted. The chaos of early celebration has mellowed into something calmer, less shouting, more soft conversations. You find yourself at the long table beside your husband, chewing on barley bread while listening to 2 elders debate whether dried cod is more romantic than pickled herring. Pickled herring has commitment, one says. You have to wait for it. It's the perfect atmosphere to talk about what happens after the wedding glow fades, what life looks like in a longhouse where the guests have gone home, the fire is yours alone, and the goats aren't just decorative. Because marriage in Viking society was not a static arrangement. It evolved. People died, remarried, moved, inherited, lost fortunes, gained them back, and tried again. And one of the most socially transformative moments, widowhood. Widows in Norse culture were not automatically cast aside or shrouded in lifelong mourning. In fact, becoming a widow often elevated a woman's status. A widow could control property, run her household entirely on her own terms, and, here's the real kicker, remarry or not, depending on what best served her interests. Historians agree that widows had more legal independence than many married or unmarried women. They could bring lawsuits, make land deals, and even sponsor feasts. Some owned slaves, ships, and trading posts. Others became the glue that held families together, matriarchs in their own right, not defined by their deceased husbands, but by their surviving legacies. There's a recorded case in the Icelandic Gragas law code of a widow who chose to keep her late husband's estate and hire a steward rather than marry again. Her children supported her, so did her community, and no one questioned her right to do so. Of course, not all widows had it easy. Much depended on class, location, and family support. Some were pressured to remarry quickly, especially if their husbands died young or left behind debts. Others became pawns again in the matchmaking game. Widowed women of high status were often targets for ambitious men hoping to gain access to land, wealth, or a desirable lineage. But the key difference was choice. A widow had legal standing. She could say yes, or no, or wait. In a world where many women were first maneuvered into marriage, widowhood opened a door that didn't exist before. And what about widowers? Men who lost their wives were also allowed, and expected, to remarry, particularly if children needed raising or land needed managing. But socially, they didn't gain as much. A man without a wife might still hold his land and position, but he was often seen as incomplete. The household ran better with a woman at the helm, meals were more frequent, clothes less itchy, goats less likely to wander indoors. You think now of a woman you met earlier, a silver-haired widow named Astrid who arrived alone, brought her own ale, and immediately won a riddle contest with a joke about onions and dishonesty. She told you her late husband had died in a boat fire. He was trying to impress me with a lightning ritual, she said. It almost worked. She's since turned his former trading outpost into a weaving cooperative, and is now considering whether to take on a younger husband, just for the entertainment. Fringe tales abound of widows who never remarried, and instead became lore keepers, healers, or landowners. One story tells of a woman named Thora, who inherited 3 longhouses after her husband died and refused all proposals unless the man could beat her in a storytelling duel. Spoiler, none could. She died wealthy, single, and deeply satisfied. Historians still argue whether this was common or exceptional. Did most widows really exercise such autonomy? Or are these sagas embellishing rare cases for dramatic flair? The archaeological record supports both sides. Some graves show widows buried with wealth and household symbols, others with little to mark their status. As always, Viking reality was not a monolith. You watch now as your husband pours you a cup of herbal tea, your preferred alternative to mead, and gently sets it in front of you. "Did I burn the bread again?" he asks. "Yes," you say, without looking up. "But only a little this time." He grins, sheepish. You smile. It's a small thing, a burned crust, a quiet cup. But this is the shape marriage begins to take after the ceremonies fade. Not feasts or flames, but moments, trust earned, duties shared, laughter passed back and forth like bowls of stew. Later that evening, as you and your husband walk the edge of the field in comfortable silence, you spot Astrid watching the sunset alone, her wool cloak pulled high, her fingers counting silver rings. You don't pity her, you envy her just a little, because whether through death, divorce, or defiance, Viking women found ways to reclaim their stories, even when those stories didn't end in love. The wind today smells like salt, horsehair, and anticipation. It's day 8, officially the final day of your wedding, and people are already beginning to pack up their carts, count their remaining cheeses, and argue over who left whose boots by the fire. "The longhouse is still full, Aicho." But there's a quiet undercurrent of departure, the way a tide pulls gently before it disappears altogether. You, however, are headed towards something new, because your father-in-law has just pulled you aside, beard twitching with the seriousness of someone about to discuss trade routes or tax disputes. Instead, he says this: "We need to talk about the Saxons." Right, so today's topic: foreign brides, political marriages, and the very tricky business of marrying across enemy lines. You follow him down a narrow footpath to a small council shed, really just a table under a canopy of goatskins, where he proceeds to lay out several pebbles in careful lines, as if playing Hnefatafel with the fate of nations. You nod along. Historically, Viking marriage wasn't always about strengthening bonds within a village or a clan. Sometimes it was about forging peace, or at least a temporary ceasefire, with the people on the other side of the sword. That's where hostage brides come in. Now, let's clarify. The term hostage might sound harsh, but in many cases, it wasn't exactly imprisonment. It was diplomacy by matrimony. 2 feuding chieftains, often one Norse, one foreign, would agree to peace, sealed by the marriage of a daughter to the rival's son, brother, or elderly uncle who swore he was still quite virile, thank you. These women often entered enemy territory armed only with their dowry and the weight of family expectations. They were symbols, peacemakers, insurance policies with braided hair and linen veils. Historians agree that these marriages were common between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Slavs, and occasionally even Byzantines. But historians still argue whether these unions ever truly fostered trust or merely extended the battlefield into the bedroom. There's a fringe account of a Viking warband leader who married a Frankish noblewoman in a political treaty. She allegedly arrived with 50 barrels of wine, 2 choir boys, and a portable chapel. The Vikings were so confused by the singing that they renamed her Helga the Echo. She eventually converted half the camp to Christianity, the other half just like the wine. You sip your tea now and imagine that noblewoman trying to teach table manners to men who use skulls for mugs. Courage doesn't always come with a sword. Back in the longhouse, you notice a woman with dark braids and unfamiliar dress sitting near the hearth. She's quiet, observant, speaking Norse with a heavy accent. One of the uncles mutters that she's from the east, some Russ blood, and married into the clan last spring after her father offered her as part of a trading pact. Smart girl, he says, knows how to pickle cabbage 5 ways. You catch her eye, and she smiles, brief but knowing. There's an unspoken bond between foreign brides, a recognition that their role is heavier, more layered. They're not just joining households, they're merging worlds, often expected to adopt the customs of their new home while still being ambassadors of the old. And sometimes they were resented for it. Jealousy, suspicion, blame when things went wrong. If peace failed, the foreign bride became an easy scapegoat. She cursed the harvest, someone might say. She angered the gods. It wasn't fair, but it was real. Yet these women weren't just pawns. Some wielded extraordinary influence. If their husbands trusted them, if they bore sons, if they managed estates effectively, they could reshape entire regions. One notable figure, Astrid of the North, allegedly convinced her husband to adopt coin-based trade over bartering. The saga says she sealed the deal by hiding his favorite axe until he agreed. Strategy. Effective. You reflect on your own marriage now. It's not diplomatic in the geopolitical sense. Your husband isn't a warlord. He once lost a fight with a goose. But your union is a joining of 2 extended clans, 2 ways of doing things, 2 fires that now burn under the same roof. You're learning his family's dialect quirks, their preference for spicy broth, their habit of storing garlic in the rafters for spiritual protection, and because it smells funny when it falls. He's learning that you like your bread not burned, and that you absolutely will rearrange his storage shelves. It's not war, but it is negotiation. And as the sun dips behind the pines, and guests begin hugging goodbye, handing off bundles of leftovers and trying to steal back their own mugs, you find yourself beside that foreign bride again, the one with the eastern braids. You offer her a bit of salted fruit. She offers you a carved pin in return. You don't speak the same first language, but you both know how to make an alliance. The wind has changed. The tents have come down, the animals reloaded into carts, and the last of the guests have disappeared beyond the hills, leaving only a scattering of broken clay cups and footprints in the mud. Your wedding week is finally, officially, over. The longhouse feels enormous now, quiet, like it's trying to remember how to be itself without 50 people arguing over who drank the last of the mead. You stretch your arms, glance around the empty hall, and let out a breath you didn't know you were holding. For the first time in over a week, it's just you, your new husband, and about 40 unwashed bowls. While you stack them near the basin, your husband sits at the threshold sharpening his axe. Probably more for the symbolism than necessity. You don't ask. You're too busy contemplating today's odd topic. What makes marriage work when the gods aren't watching, and no one's handing out dowries anymore? You're about to find out. One of the most overlooked yet intimate aspects of Viking marriage was its daily life. Not the legends, not the legal terms, but the tiny habits built between two people sharing a roof and responsibilities. Because once the rituals faded, marriage became domestic. And in a world where survival depended on cooperation, marriage wasn't just emotional, it was logistical. Who mended the roof? Who butchered the sheep? Who remembered to rub bear fat on the sled runners before the freeze? Spoiler, not your husband. You're still annoyed about that one. Historians agree that Norse marriages operated on a partnership model that was more balanced than many other medieval societies. While men often had legal authority, women were expected to manage the household, and that included supervising food stores, servants, textiles, even trade. Viking wives weren't background figures. They were CEOs with good cheese-making skills. There's even archaeological evidence to back this up. Excavated homes with weaving tools, personal keys, and cooking pits placed in positions of prominence, not hidden away, but central. This suggests that the woman's domain was not a back room. It was the hearth, the heart, and the engine of survival. Still, historians still argue about how much true agency Viking women had. Were they decision makers in their own right, or merely respected as long as they upheld domestic expectations? Some sagas portray wives as cunning strategists. Others show them punished for speaking out. Like most things Viking, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Fringe examples suggest that even power dynamics within marriage were negotiable. In one Icelandic tale, a woman demanded her husband rotate cooking duties with her every other day. When he refused, she withheld affection until he gave in. The saga ends with both of them happily making stew. A rare but spicy little footnote in the scrolls of history. You return to the hearth and begin sorting dried herbs, nettle, mint, the one that smells like old socks but makes good tea. Your husband joins you, plopping down awkwardly on a stool clearly made for someone shorter. I sharpen the axe, he offers. Fantastic, you say, picking out a sprig of rosemary. I'll try not to need it today. He grins. Too bad. I was planning to cut firewood dramatically, to prove I'm still useful. Pause. Well, can you fetch water instead? He hesitates, then nods. If the bucket doesn't bite me this time. This is what Viking marriage looked like most of the time. Not the feast, not the hand fasting. Just two people learning the quirks of each other's routines, trading barbs and barley, and figuring out how to make a household run smoothly without poisoning each other. Evenings were often spent working together, spinning thread, preparing skins, sharpening tools, and yes, occasionally composing poetry. Love poems weren't just for courtship. They were a way for couples to affirm bonds, flirt across the loom, or tease each other while mending socks. You try to imagine yourself writing verse to your husband. Something like, Your beard is like moss, but it keeps the bugs out well. Pass the butter, dear, poetic genius. Truly, marriage in Viking society wasn't static. It demanded constant maintenance, like a boat or a particularly stubborn goat. It could erode through neglect or grow stronger through shared hardship. Success often depended on flexibility, humor, and the occasional well-timed threat of sleeping in the barn. You glance at your husband now, tugging the water bucket free from a frozen patch of earth with a grunt that sounds like a dying seal. Not graceful, not glorious. But when he brings it back, hands it to you without a word, then begins sweeping the floor with a pine branch he insists is traditional, you realize something important. This, too, is love, or at least a form of it, the kind that doesn't need witnesses or dowries or feasts. Just firewood, patience, and a shared joke about who really forgot to salt the fish. You tuck the herbs into their pouch. He finally sets the pine branch down, and together, in the quiet hum of an empty longhouse, your marriage begins again. The snow comes earlier than expected this year. By the end of the second moon after your wedding, the hills around the farmstead have softened into white curves. Smoke from the longhouse rises in slow, lazy spirals, and the goats wear their shaggy winter coats like proud old warriors. Life has settled, rhythms established, chores divided, jokes repeated often enough to become part of the walls. It's in this stillness that something strange begins to emerge. Affection. Not the thunderous kind sung by skalds. Not passion that burns down halls or drives lovers to exile. No, this is quieter, slower. A shared blanket. A knowing look across a smoky room. A meal saved. A tunic mended with stitches you'll never mention out loud. Viking marriages may not have started with romance, but they weren't devoid of it either. In fact, for all the cultural emphasis on function, family, and legal duty, the Norse left behind more tender expressions of love than you might expect. Historians agree that love poetry was alive and well in the Viking world, especially in later years, and while much of it was tied to courtship and desire, some verses hint at lasting bonds between spouses. One famous 10th century poem, likely composed by a husband for his wife, describes her laughter as the warm bell of the hearth, and her advice as keener than the frost's first bite. That's not flirtation. That's respect. You find yourself humming tunes you didn't know you'd remembered. One morning, you even start composing a small verse about your husband's deeply unfortunate snoring. He hears the first line and laughs so hard he nearly drops the bucket on his foot. Historians still argue whether love was considered a necessary component of Viking marriage or simply a lucky accident. The sagas often focus on tragic, doomed lovers, or political unions where love barely factors in. But the gaps in the record speak too. The domestic moments, the quiet grave sites where husbands and wives are buried side by side with matching tools, matching combs, matching brooches. These weren't assigned matches. These were earned. One fringe tale tells of a woman named Brynja who, when her husband died in battle, buried his axe with him, not for ceremony, but because it was the one she had given him. She kept the better one for herself and wore it on a loop at her belt. I married him for his farm, she allegedly said, but I stayed for his laugh. In your own home, the rituals of affection have taken on a rhythm. Your husband sharpens your spindle blades without being asked. You remember how he likes his fish, roasted with honey, not salted, like a proper baby, as you tease him, On cold nights, he heats stones and places them at the foot of the bed before you slip beneath the furs. He insists he does it for his own toes. You both know better. You also fight sometimes. Over firewood. Mostly. And whose turn it is to muck out the goat shed. Last week, you shouted across the longhouse, called him a stubborn frost-brained ox, and he grinned and shouted back, "Good, oxen plow straight." You didn't speak for 3 hours. Then he brought you an extra chunk of smoked cheese. You forgave him before the rind even hit your tongue, because marriage isn't always sweet, but it is made up of gestures. Love, in the Viking world, didn't always look like roses and moonlit dances. It looked like surviving winter together. It looked like trusting someone to watch your back and your pantry. It looked like waiting for them to come back from market with the exact soapstone pan you wanted, even if it meant arguing with the seller for an hour. It looked like saying nothing, but warming their boots by the fire anyway. You sit now at the loom, your hands moving automatically. He sits nearby, repairing the harness with a quiet kind of focus. The light is thin, the snow outside still falling. You glance at him, then back at your work. You don't need to say it, but you think it anyway. You're glad you didn't run. The snow thickens. Outside, the world has vanished under a blanket of white, the trees heavy with frost, the paths erased. Even the chickens have stopped pretending to be adventurous. They huddle in their coop like feathery monks, deeply skeptical of the weather and of you for opening the door too loudly. But inside the longhouse, everything is glowing. The hearth crackles, the stew bubbles, and your husband is trying, very seriously, to carve a comb. He says it's your Yule gift. You try, very seriously, not to laugh every time he forgets which end is the teeth. Today's story begins not with cold, but with warmth, with intimacy, the private moments of Viking marriage, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. We've talked about law, duty, dowry, and power, but now we turn to what happens when the chores are done, the doors are closed, and no one else is watching. Because even in a society that thrived on toughness and community oversight, people craved connection, solace, and, yes, a little flirtation. Let's start with the love songs. Viking culture included poetry, sure, but not just the dramatic kind where someone dies or a mountain gets burned. There were courtship poems full of riddles, wit, and even teasing double meanings. They were passed in whispers, etched in wood, sewn into clothing hems, or traded like secret handshakes. Historians agree that in many regions, especially Iceland and parts of coastal Norway, lovers communicated in veiled verse. A woman might leave a line near the food stash. A man might answer by scratching a reply into her spindle. If someone walked in, it all looked like inventory notes. One preserved poem fragment reads, "Your words hide in wool. Sharp as a needle's bite. I feel them in my sleeve. Romance. Subtle. Spiky. And slightly itchy. You've started trying it, just to see if he notices. Yesterday, you tied a red thread into his belt loop. He asked if it was a warning. You told him it meant, don't eat the last of the dried pears. He ate them anyway, but he left you the best walnut. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were widespread or just a pastime of the literate elite. But even illiterate couples found ways to build intimacy through shared labor, small gifts, or body language, which brings us to a fascinating fringe tradition from Eastern Scandinavia, the pillow oath. No, not the kind you make when you're drunk and overly philosophical. This was a nighttime whisper between spouses, promises spoken just before sleep, often renewed during winter festivals. They weren't legally binding, but socially, they carried weight. A man might say, "I will keep your fire warm until the next full moon." A woman might reply, "And I will keep the pantry full, unless you forget to close the chicken door again." They were part vow, part lullaby, part shared joke, one that no one else ever heard. You try it now, lying beside your husband beneath the furs. The fire is low, the stew has settled in your belly, and the cold presses against the walls like a polite intruder. "I promise not to throw snow at you tomorrow," you whisper. He turns, grinning in the dark. "Even if I beat you at taffle? Maybe one snowball? That's fair." And then, after a moment of silence, "I promise to finish your comb before Yule." You say nothing, but under the blanket, your hand finds his. Because physical closeness was part of Viking life, too. Not just for procreation or duty, but comfort. The sagas mention little of it explicitly. They weren't big on mushy scenes. But the archaeological record tells another story. Married couples often shared graves, their personal items carefully arranged side by side. In one instance, a comb was found nestled between a man's cloak pin and a woman's belt buckle. That doesn't happen by accident. Marriage in this world was many things, sometimes transactional, often political, occasionally explosive, but at its best, it was a refuge, a shield not just against enemies, but against the cold. You think of that as you rise the next morning to light the fire, your breath visible in the chill. Your husband grumbles beneath the blanket. You hand him a hot cup before he opens his eyes. He mumbles, "You're too good to me." You reply, "Only when you're asleep." He laughs into the cup, and you both carry on. Quietly, deliberately, intimately, because some marriages begin with alliances and end with affection, and some begin with affection and stay there. The days are growing longer now. The snow begins to retreat from the fields like a tired old warrior giving up its claim. Ice thaws in fat, dripping clumps, and birds, loud, bold, deeply ungraceful birds, have returned to argue in the thatching. Spring is whispering at the edges of the world again. And with the thaw comes a new kind of ritual, planning. Today, as you and your husband sit together with ink-stained fingers and goat hair quills, you're not composing poetry. You're mapping out land, herds, and future repairs. Because in Viking marriage, one of the most powerful things a couple could do was build together. Not just walls, not just beds, but futures. Land was everything in this world. Security, wealth, inheritance, status. And once you were married, managing it was no longer a solo task. It was a partnership, deeply entangled and sometimes contentious, especially when it came to who owned what. Historians agree that Viking women could, and often did, own land, either through dowry, inheritance, or widowhood, and in many regions, women maintained separate ownership of the property they brought into the marriage, which meant that while a couple shared their household, they also held private stakes, a woven patchwork of ownership and responsibility. Take, for instance, the marriage contract, not always written, but definitely spoken and witnessed. It often included details about who controlled which fields, how profits would be split, and what would happen if someone died or ran off to join a trading voyage in Miklagard. You joke, but it happened. Your own arrangement is simple but sturdy. You brought flax fields and weaving tools. He brought the livestock and a very stubborn horse. You manage the storage and dairy. He handles the fences and trade trips. And every moon cycle, you meet to update each other like co-owners of a small business, which, in a way, you are. He's still learning how to explain accounts out loud without panicking. You're still learning not to accidentally rearrange the tool shed. Historians still argue about how equal this division truly was. Some point to legal texts that favored men in disputes. Others highlight sagas and court records where women clearly asserted authority and won. The truth, as always, seems to depend on class, region, and individual stubbornness. A fringe document from Gotland describes a wife named Ingi who refused to share grazing rights with her husband after he neglected their goat herd for 3 straight winters. She built a fence, dug a ditch, and installed a gate that only she had the key to. The case went to the local thing, and the court sided with her. The husband was ordered to mind the goats, or stay on his side of the fence. Literally. So no, Viking marriage wasn't always warm and fuzzy, but it was structured. A system in which both partners had stakes and responsibilities. And in that structure, you begin to notice something soft emerging. Not just affection, not just domestic intimacy, but trust. Your husband now consults you before making trade agreements. You ask his opinion before accepting new weavers into your circle. You fight less about storage and more about how many apples to dry for winter. He says 3 baskets. You say 5. You're drying 6. And there's pride too. Not boastful, not shouted, but a quiet satisfaction when someone in the village says, "Their land grows better barley now." Or, "You can always ask them for honest weight on flour." You find yourself dreaming not of escape or endings, but of improvements. A new loom, a better smokehouse, maybe even a child. You haven't spoken of that yet. It hangs between you like a tentative idea, not urgent, but not ignored. You know it's possible. You also know it's not a requirement. Viking women weren't judged solely by motherhood. They were landowners, judges, merchants. But still, a part of you wonders. One evening, you mention it casually while sorting beans. If a child came, what would we name it? He doesn't look up. He's thinking, seriously, not dodging. Not Thor, he finally says. Everyone names their son Thor. It's like calling him Dave. You laugh. He adds, if it's a girl, maybe Freydis, after my aunt, the one who chased off raiders with a cooking pan. You nod. That sounds about right. He smiles and goes back to sorting. In that moment, you realize what you've built together is not just a legal alliance, not just shared property, but a foundation, a structure strong enough to hold possibility. And whether or not a child ever joins you here, you know one thing for certain. This is your home. Not by fate, not by arrangement, but by design. The festival of Summermal is approaching, the ancient Norse welcome to summer. You've been helping prepare for days now, washing linens, hanging wreaths of early greens, and politely reminding your husband not to eat all the honeyed hazelnuts before the feast. He ate half. You're calling that progress. This festival marks the turning of the year, the fresh start after a long winter, and for many Viking couples, it was also a time to renew their bonds, or let them go. Because unlike modern marriage, which tends to treat the wedding as a single, one-time vow, Norse unions could be understood more fluidly. They were built on ritual, yes, but also continuity. They could be reaffirmed seasonally through oaths, gifts, or just by not walking away. So today's topic, seasonal rituals of marriage, and the ways couples kept love alive, even when it was buried under layers of wool and barley flour. Let's begin with the simplest tradition, the shared offering. On holy days like Sumarmal, couples were often expected to make a joint sacrifice to the gods, usually Freyr and Freya, the deities of fertility, prosperity, and love, and excellent hair. This could be a food offering, a carved token, or a song sung together around the fire. It wasn't legally binding, but it was socially powerful. A way of saying, we're still in this, still choosing each other. This morning, you and your husband make your own offering, a bowl of spring porridge, sweetened with honey, tucked beneath the old oak near the field. He adds a piece of his favorite dried fish. You raise an eyebrow. A bit generous, you say. He shrugs. I trust Freyr more than my cousins. Fair. Historians agree that these festivals weren't just about harvest cycles. They were social resets, a time to patch up feuds, renegotiate land deals, and yes, evaluate marriages. In some cases, couples who had grown distant might choose to part ways around this time, dissolving their union with the same community presence that had once blessed it. Historians still argue whether this was common or rare. The sagas often make such separations seem dramatic, usually involving betrayal or blood, but legal records suggest many divorces were quiet, mutual, and rooted in practicality. We tried, they might say, but your snoring and my mother didn't mix. There's even a fringe legend from Hedeby that tells of a couple who met each summer mall to review their year together, like an annual performance review. If both were satisfied, they exchanged new gifts. If one wasn't, they spent the next season negotiating terms. They stayed together for 12 years, then amicably separated when she wanted to move south, and he didn't want to give up the cold baths. You and your husband, so far, are doing well on your own imaginary review. He's fixed the barn roof, eventually, stopped storing onions in your wool, mostly, and finally admitted that yes, you were right about the better way to salt fish. You, in return, have not made fun of his sewing since February. That's basically a vow. There's something comforting about these small recalibrations. Marriage isn't a static thing in the Norse world. It breathes, changes, stretches, or shrinks, based on how you nurture it. There's no shame in adjusting expectations, only in pretending they don't need adjusting. Tonight, as the festival fire is lit, and neighbors gather with garlands and jugs of ale, you and your husband dance together, not the wild youthful spinning of new lovers, but a gentler sway. He's offbeat. You're always 2 steps ahead, but you keep returning to each other. You make a loop around the flame, and when he nearly trips on a rock, you catch his elbow and mutter, "Graceful as ever." He bows dramatically. I practice falling for you. Someone hands you a slice of berry cake. Someone else slips a wreath over your shoulders. In the distance, you hear children singing about swallows and summer winds, and for just a moment, you remember that first day again. Smoke, braids, nerves, a knot tied in front of 50 people. Now it's just the 2 of you. No witnesses, no goats, just a promise renewed with porridge, porch repairs, and patience. And really, what more does a marriage need? The sun now lingers longer in the sky, casting golden light across the damp fields well into the evening. You can finally walk barefoot on the grass again, just not near the goat shed. Obviously, the hens are nesting, the bees are buzzing, and your husband is trying to grow onions in a way that looks suspiciously like he's just burying them and hoping for magic. Summer in the Viking world is a time of growth, but not just for crops. It's when marriages either settle in like well-worn shoes, or slowly start to split at the seams. You're still walking in yours. And today, you're thinking not just about now, but about legacy. Because Viking marriage wasn't just about the people who made the vows. It was about what those two people left behind, in land, in stories, and in children. Let's talk about what it meant to raise a family in a world where winter could kill a goat in a night, where every trade route came with risk, and where a son might leave on a raid and come back 3 years taller with tattoos and a completely new accent. Historians agree that Viking families were deeply pragmatic. Children were valued, absolutely, but not just for sentimental reasons. They were the future workers, the next line of defense, the heirs to your fields, and household reputation. Raising children was a communal task, often shared across extended family, grandparents, aunts, even the neighbor who always smelled like fish, but told excellent stories. And yet, for all the practical considerations, there's clear evidence of affection, too. Carvings of parents holding infants, tiny grave offerings, wooden toys, miniature tools, sagas that include lullabies and family jokes. One poem from the Poetic Edda even includes advice on parenting. Raise your child in strength, but soften their sleep with song. That's not just survival, that's tenderness. You're not a parent yet, but lately, the question hovers more often in your mind. Not in fear, not in expectation, just there. Your husband has taken to building a second cradle. For storage, he claims. You don't point out that it's far too small for tools and far too carefully carved for firewood. Instead, you run your fingers along the rim when no one's looking. But Viking families weren't all about happy endings and healthy children. Infant mortality was high. Life was short. Some marriages weathered those losses. Some didn't. Historians still argue whether grief pulled couples apart more often than it brought them closer. The sagas often dramatize loss, tears, curses, sometimes vengeance. But there are quieter records too. A letter carved into wood from a father to his wife simply reads, "The gods took her. I saw her eyes in the snow. Come home. You don't know what kind of future awaits you, but you do know this. If children come, they'll be raised in a household where both parents tell stories, dry herbs, and argue politely over firewood, where love isn't a performance, but a practice. And what if they don't come? Then you'll pass on your knowledge anyway. You'll teach the neighbor's daughter to spin thread, your cousin's boy to hold a carving knife properly, your nieces how to identify which mushrooms won't kill them, and which ones might just enough to scare a rude guest. Legacy isn't always blood. Sometimes it's behavior. A fringe tale from the Lofoten Islands tells of a childless couple who took in a shipwrecked boy. He stayed with them until he was grown, then named his trading boat after the wife who taught him to mend nets. The name of the boat, Quiet Hearth. Tonight, you and your husband walk along the edge of the fields. He gestures proudly to a patch of half-drowned onions. You clap. He bows. You both laugh. Then, with no warning, he says, "If we have a child, I hope they get your temper." You stop. "My temper?" He nods. It's honest. Also, It scares the goats. Useful. You roll your eyes. But later, when the stars come out and the longhouse is quiet, you find yourself whispering names into the dark, just to see how they sound. Whether or not they ever belong to someone real doesn't matter yet. You're building something slowly, carefully, with laughter, sweat, and small stubborn onions. And whatever grows from that, it will be yours. It rains for 3 days straight, not the gentle, misty kind that makes the hills shimmer, but the kind that floods the chicken coop, turns paths into bogs, and makes every article of clothing smell faintly like mildew and disappointment. Your husband builds a new drainage trench. You suggest, gently, that he test it before digging it in the wrong direction next time. He nods, then mutters something about hydrological betrayal. You pretend not to hear. It's been nearly a year since your wedding day. 12 full moons. 1 very smoky winter. 2 minor arguments about fermented cabbage. 3 surviving chickens. And a growing sense, quiet, steady, that you're no longer simply sharing space. You're sharing life. Today, you're preparing for your first anniversary feast, which, in Viking fashion, is less about sentiment and more about showing everyone you're still a functioning unit. No blood feuds, no runaway spouses, no mysterious fires. In other words, success. You clean the longhouse while your husband ventures out to barter for honey. Just don't bring back more fish, you warned. We're still finding scales in the bedding. As you sweep the floor, your mind drifts to that first chaotic morning. Braids pulled too tight, boots too stiff, hands bound together in front of a skeptical crowd. You barely knew him. You barely knew yourself. Really. Now you know his favorite spoon. His irritated silence when the firewood is damp. The way he always leaves the last piece of cheese, even though he thinks you don't notice. You know the scar on his left thumb. The song he hums when anxious. The way he listens when you speak. Really listens. Like your words are stones he's laying into the foundation of something sacred. Historians agree that marriage in the Viking world was as much about social cohesion as personal happiness. But they still argue whether love, in the modern sense, played a central role, or was simply a fortunate accident when things went right. Fringe records suggest that some couples renewed their vows yearly with quiet rituals, repeating promises not in front of witnesses, but beside the hearth, or over bread, or by gifting a newly sharpened knife. One tale describes a couple who celebrated by rebuilding part of their roof together each year. A marriage strong as shingles. They were probably very annoying. You and your husband, for your part, celebrate by cooking a better meal than usual, cleaning the longhouse top to bottom, and, this year, planting a row of herbs together. He pretends to know what he's doing. You don't correct him too harshly. Growth, after all, takes time. Later, as the rain slows and a few brave neighbors arrive with early strawberries and suspiciously re-gifted woolen mittens, you look around and realize something unexpected. This is no longer his longhouse. It's not even yours. It's both. The benches are arranged how you like them. The salt is kept near the hearth because he forgets otherwise. The dried herbs hang from a beam you reinforced together after the last storm. Even the chickens seem to cluck in mutual agreement now. Except for the one. There's always one. And you are no longer just his wife. You are the keeper of the keys. the name whispered in the market when someone needs advice, the woman who can split kindling with one hand and solve neighbor disputes with the other. You're not waiting for his approval or anyone's. You've built a life that speaks for itself. Tonight, when the feast winds down and the neighbors head home, you and your husband sit quietly by the fire, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the steam rise from your mugs. You ask, "Think we did all right?" He replies, "I haven't drowned, starved, or been chased off with a broom yet." So, yes. You rest your head on his shoulder. The fire crackles. A log shifts, and in that moment, without ceremony or song, you know, the marriage you began with fear, expectation, and fish-stained nerves has become something real, something earned, something yours. The fire is low now, just embers whispering in the dark. The longhouse is quiet, the neighbors gone, the dishes stacked and forgotten until morning. You shift beneath the blanket, the warmth of the hearth kissing your skin, your husband breathing softly beside you. Outside, the rain is soft again, more a sigh than a storm. You close your eyes and let it all drift, images of braids and mead, of goat escapes and legal squabbles, of laughter whispered under fur blankets and shared honey cakes on quiet mornings. The Viking world wasn't gentle, but your corner of it has found softness, not in spite of marriage, but within it, between you and someone who, once upon a time, was a stranger holding your hand in front of too many people knocked down. Now, it's just the two of you, and the longhouse, and the fire, and whatever tomorrow brings. So breathe deep. Let the wind hum through the walls like an old lullaby. Let the ache in your shoulders fade, and the weight of the year settle into something solid and still. You've come far, through storm and snow, and awkward dinners, and you're still here, together. Now sleep, knowing the hearth is strong, the roof is patched, and someone you trust is watching the fire while you dream. You're safe, you're home, and the longhouse will still be warm in the morning. End of script. Sweet dreams.